Good afternoon, everybody. Wow, that was good. Welcome. I'm Phil Levy. I'm Senior Fellow on the Global Economy at the Chicago Council, and I'm thrilled to welcome our panels today. We're delighted that you're joining us for two back-to-back sessions with a short break in between. And let me just say that we're very grateful to our sponsors, our international and civic partners, and all the delegates who have joined us today. Our first panel is going to be on financing the global city, after a break that will be followed by Win or Lose, Investing in High-Profile Events. Throughout, we hope that your phones are silenced, but not necessarily off. We encourage you to tweet at Chicago Forum with the hashtag GlobalCities2016, all running together as hashtags are wont to do. So you can tweet anytime to ask questions of the panel during Q&A at the end of the discussion. And now, please welcome our moderator for the panel, Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson, François Bergere, Mayor Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz, Dan Pelino, and last but by no means least, Umran Inan. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me add my welcome to the panel and thanks to the forum for having us here in this wonderful setting. So we've already set the context here. We know 2.5 to 3 billion people have to be accommodated by these global cities over the next several years, and I think we've all pretty much figured out by now that's not going to come cheap. When I was reading the FT special report on global cities that you will have seen yesterday or today, I was very struck by a quote from the former mayor of Barcelona, who's, I can't pronounce his name, I think it's Juan Clo, who's now the director of UN Habitat, who said urbanization is like a money printing machine. You know, there's a huge financial upside to urbanization for creating wealth in the world, but at the same time, there can be no successful urbanization without a budget. Now we're lucky to be joined today by several people who manage budgets who've thought deeply about this subject. And I hope we'll be able to go into some quite practical examples about the pluses and minuses of this sort of financial equation. The panel represents two very diverse global cities, represents an industry view, represents a sort of multinational organization view, and I hope we'll get some of that diversity in there. The other great quote I was struck by in the last 24 hours was Hank Paulson just saying, "Where's the money going to come from?" So that may be our opening and closing question for the panel, but let's try and keep it focused on that very question. Just a brief word of introduction to our panelists. François Bergere, to my right, is the program manager for the World Bank's Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Project. He literally wrote the book on public-private partnerships. In fact, he's written 2 of them and more papers than I can count on the subject. So is a particular expert on this. Mayor Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz, the mayor of Warsaw for 10 years now. Right. Is also president of Eurocities, so works with 140 other European cities to solve a lot of the problems we're debating today. To her right, we have Dan Pelino, the general manager of IBM's global sector, public sector business, who also leads IBM's Smart Cities initiative. And then rounding us off here, we have Umran Inan, the president of, now, how do I pronounce your university? Koç University in Istanbul, who also sits on the faculty at Stanford. I think he may be a rocket scientist. He's a geophysics and near space and similar things expert. So we have high expectations. I want to start this off by turning to Dan as a representative of the sort of the industry view of this. You know, this is a financial panel. Let's start with the people who have to make money from this this quandary of how you finance the global city. Dan, what seems to you most pressing about this as you survey the landscape and the opportunity and the challenges for a business like
IBM.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. And what a wonderful setting, and the agenda throughout the couple of days is just a tremendous opportunity, I think, to share best practices and ideas, and I hope that we get a chance to do that with you today here. We are at a unique time in history. Never before have more people been in movement around the world than they are now. If you were to come with me to the University of Virginia Batten School of Leadership, you would see that they are streaming in every day the amount of people that are moving from one city to another around the world. And when you see that information, you quickly realize these predictions that we will see 75% of the world's population in 250 cities around the world by 2050. It is happening. And so what is happening with that is the leaders that are here are competing for the time, talent, and treasures of those individuals. Whether it's Katrina hits New Orleans, and do you think all the great musicians went to Austin and San Antonio? Or do you think they went to Barcelona? Do you think they went to Vienna? Do you think they went to Amsterdam? It's a global world that we live in, and the generation that is making decisions about where they want to live are making that decision off of three very specific notions. Infrastructure. Want clean water, want Wi-Fi, want the types of services that you should have for transportation of infrastructure. Number two, citizen-based services. At the top of the list, healthcare. I want access to the right type of healthcare. And last, and number three, and maybe the most important, the promise from one generation to the next is education. The promise from one generation to the next is education. Time, talent, and treasures. So here we have this very unique situation in the world today where the world order is changing. Cities will be redefined. They will become regions. Those regions will redefine states. The way decisions will be made will be far different than they are today. And the level of competition to attract in what will be the livelihood of the future of cities has never been greater than it is today. And so consequently, the idea of public-private partnerships, philanthropy, new ideas, that's why we're all here. And so I think that's the great challenge that we have. Never before in the history of time have we seen more people in movement than we see today. And there's a lot of reasons for them, and you know what those reasons are. But now, what are we going to do about it? And so just as an opening to, all right, how do we finance it? The table stakes are significant. And so from where we sit, and I have the opportunity to be involved in 170 countries around the world. We do Smarter Cities initiatives where we spend about $500,000, where we go into cities and help them think about what can happen and what's the art of the possible. And then we work collaboratively to try and have them be competitive into the future. It's an exciting time, but one that I think requires events like this to get together and share best practices.
So, Madam Mayor, what do those mega trends look like in the context of a city like Warsaw?
I think that in the case of Warsaw, of course, there are certain conditions which we have to fulfill. First, for the last 14 years, we are in the EU, which is very, I would say, helpful to us. But Warsaw is the capital city, so it means that unemployment is lower, is below 4%. On average, it's about 9% in Poland. So we also the level of life is 3 times higher than on average in Poland. So thanks to these EU funds, we could fulfill the gap and we could invest in infrastructure. There is such a program in the EU infrastructure and environment, which is very important for us because thanks to this program we constructed subway, we we changed for modern the tramway system, and of course also buses. The biggest spendings in our budget is for public transport and for education.
Right.
However,
So when you think about infrastructure, transport is the biggest
I mean the construction, and the purchase of new, for example, hybrid buses or new tramways, and also to start to construct the second line of subway. We have, comparison to the other cities, we are about 2 million inhabitants, so it was for the last 40, 50 years, it was lack of subway, because it's the best for the traffic, and it is the best from the point of an environment. So, but of course, and the second amount of money which we spend is for the education.
Right.
Education is very, of course, everybody knows it's very important, but it's subsidized by the government. But at the same time, we have to add the money, because the level of wages, the level of education in Warsaw is higher than in the other cities, where the subsidies sometimes is enough for the mayors. So this is about our main issues. It's very interesting, because we have a little bit different system of revenues, because about 50% is from the taxes, but these are state taxes according with the law. We have a right to get money from income tax, from corporate taxes, and some others, and the rest is subsidies and fees, which are our fees, which are established by the council.
Right.
And what is also very important, we take the loans, the credits, mainly from the EIB, which is European Investment Bank. These are rather soft conditions, frankly, and from the EBRD, which these conditions are not very soft. So and we also issue bonds.
Right.
So, for example, for the domestic market, we issued $500,000 bonds, and we finance this way, because the question was also about PPP. Yes, so. This is quite difficult, I should say. First, because everybody makes a joke that it's private-public partnership, prison and prosecutor, yes, because it's not so easy to organize this PPP. And even here, when it was started, I remember when I read in Boston, they had problems as well. It was many years ago. And but what we try to create a good investment climate for PPP, and we did certain things. For example, the system of city bikes is completely PPP. We call it Veturilo in Warsaw. It's very popular. It's quite large area, quite covered, quite a large space. It's for about $5 million. And also on the system of PPP, we constructed the bus shelters,
Right.
1,500 bus shelters, which and we also like to construct two parking space for underground, because it's quite difficult. We have traffic as well. However, we are much smaller city than Chicago, and so we are using PPP for this kind of facilities and arrangement. We are thinking also into the future, because we need to build new nurseries and kindergartens, and we think that maybe we will do it in a PPP system.
Let's come back and look at some of those PPP projects in more detail in a moment. I just wanted to turn to you, Umran. We've mentioned education twice here already. Educational institutions such as yours are both recipients of funding, and they can also be origins. They can of funding with through sort of encouraging innovative businesses and investment in R&D, and things like that. How do you think about the university's role in this debate about financing the global city?
Thank you very much. I'm also pleased to be here. Now, I'm in Istanbul. Istanbul is a mega city of 16 to 17 million people. And it spans 2 continents. There are 3 bridges. There are 2 under the water tunnels. And it's a huge metropolitan that has, of course, massive traffic issues and other problems that you would expect. However, it's actually has gone into a transformation in the last 10 to 15 years, partly because of the aspirations of Turkey to join the European Union, which brought new legislation and transparency and accountability in budgeting, for example, local responsibility rather than central responsibility in terms of budgeting and implementation of budgets and accountability. So it turned the municipality into an environment in which, for example, the city buses are run like a business. And then the waterways are run as another business, and they're all held accountable to budgets. The university, Andrew is right, we do receive funding because the importance of R&D and innovation is also realized to a large degree. So for example, Istanbul has a development agency. This is actually not under the mayor, but under the governor office. Istanbul Development Agency provides substantial funding to universities. And you know, these could be anything from development of biofuels, development of hospices for developmentally disabled children as part of a school of nursing activity. They could be development of new materials, all kinds of things. But there's substantial investment into innovation because I believe, like Secretary Paulson said yesterday, a lot of the savings, a lot of better financing is going to come from less waste of energy, for example. For example, insulation of buildings, new materials for insulation so you don't lose energy in the winter and you don't lose energy in the summer is extremely important. Lighting, intelligent lighting of cities, turning off the lights in certain regions at certain times of the night automatically, for example, would be huge savings. I mean, 10, 20, 30% of savings in energy. So I think rather than coming up with new ways of energy creation, if you just concentrate on less loss, then I think there's potential benefits to be ensued substantially. So this is interesting. Intelligent transportation is another area where universities can work together with municipalities, because therein again you have substantial potential to save time, energy, and new investment if you can operate the various transportation mechanisms in synchronism with one another and also with communication. Wi-Fi that was mentioned is another area. I mean, there are a multiplicity of ways in which you can project a broadband access to a city, and one may be orders of magnitude cheaper than another. So this is an area that universities can, again, come in and contribute. There are probably many other ways in which I can't even, medicine and in the medical care, provision of medical care, provision of nursing care, and doing so in cost-efficient ways that also maintain high quality is another area that universities need to examine. So I believe this is a very important set of opportunities for cities to engage their universities. I was in Chicago 2 years ago in one of these forums, and there were some local community people that I think I was on a panel with Northwestern president and Illinois president and Chicago president. And they asked us, they said, well, what do you do for the local community? You know, making it sound as if we don't have a right to exist if we didn't do these things for the local community. And I think uniformly, all of the presidents on the stage, we said, look, we are just producing the best possible science and pushing the boundaries of knowledge, publishing papers, and please make use of those findings. But we can't distort our mission to come in and solve your local problems that municipalities should solve. But we can produce outstanding research and new knowledge that you can take advantage of.
Okay, we should talk about that sort of,
Yes.
how you bridge that gap between
Yes.
academia and
Yes.
and the sort of cities in which you live. So when did you write your first book on PPP?
Well, that was 5 years ago.
Okay, and what has changed since then?
Well, not so much, actually. I think we all agree here that we need better and more infrastructure if cities are effectively to deliver on their promise, which is to unleash growth, economic and social growth potential by delivering infrastructure services to the citizens. And this can only be achieved through more and better infrastructure, particularly so for emerging countries. As you know, the World Bank's remit is financing and assisting developing emerging market economies into reaching a higher level of development. And we reckon that no country has ever achieved sort of middle income status without first going through the threshold of a 50% urbanization. Industrial developed countries usually stand at 75–80%. So there's a strong correlation between urbanization and development, but not necessarily a causality. The real causality is between urban infrastructures and development. And here's the tricky point, actually. It's not easy to finance infrastructure. Infrastructure projects usually come into lumpy sums, very long-term horizons in terms of amortization and generating the benefits that they're supposed to provide, and not something that you can finance easily out of an operating budget. Even in the case, which is not the general case, where you effectively generate a surplus in your operating budget. You can't just finance infrastructure on a pay-as-you-go basis.
It's front-loaded cost.
Yeah,
with a
it's
long-
front-loaded. So you have to find the necessary sort of big-ticket financing in order to effectively deliver these new infrastructure assets that are required, particularly so, and nowhere truer than in developing countries. How do you do that? That's the difficulty almost all developing countries face in their cities. They stand basically at the crossroads of three major trends of our era. First one is urbanization, very rapid population growth. We consider that in many cities in Africa, for example, or South Asia, population growth is around 5% a year. It's a doubling of population every 12 years. So a very strong challenge. There's the other trend of fiscal decentralization, sort of assignment of new responsibilities in terms of managing provision of services and the corresponding expenditure and revenues to the local level of government. And all this happens against a backdrop of increased budgetary constraints, fiscal adjustment. So how do you do? I mean, the catch-22, you're not going to be in a position to effectively rely on intergovernmental transfers in most developing countries because the national government basically has the same constraint. They can't really provide for.
They're not going to favor the global city over the national.
Well, the capital city might get a sort of special treatment, but beyond that, usually they don't have the sort of fiscal space necessary. So you're left with basically either sort of own source revenue, which are usually very limited because there's not much room for property taxes, fees. There's a issue about affordability, about the overall standard of living and the level of revenue. Or you can borrow your way into investing in infrastructure. So when you have the possibility to get this type of financing from multilaterals, all the better. You mentioned the IB or EBRD in the case of Warsaw. In many developing countries, actually, this is not a possibility. The World Bank itself is not very keen on lending to cities without a sovereign guarantee by the national state.
And how unusual, how difficult is it to get that?
Well, the thing with guarantees is that you can use them a few times, but then you get to the limit of what you can effectively use in terms of guarantees. You sort of accumulate off-balance sheet contingent liabilities, and at some stage the lenders themselves would not feel confident. So basically we think that the sort of ultimate response should be a greater participation by the private sector into providing and managing infrastructure assets and services. Can be done through so-called user-paid PPPs or contractual schemes where the bulk of the ultimate responsibility for paying back the infrastructure lies with the users through fees, or it can be done through government pay PPPs where it's the responsibility of the granting authority, right, the municipality, to pay back the investment. But for that, you have to improve operational, financial management, increase creditworthiness, accompany the city in getting a sort of first credit rating, build and sustain a credit history to instill confidence in potential lenders, and that's precisely the kind of technical assistance we effectively offer cities in developing countries, right, helping them get to that stage where they can effectively get financing out of the merits of their own balance sheet, the capacity to manage their accounts and the finances.
I want to hear the mayor's reaction to that, but Umran, you have a...
Yeah, I just have a point there. I completely support everything that was said, because I think in Istanbul, the third bridge, for example, across the Bosphorus, which is the widest bridge in the world, because it has 3 lanes each way of automobile traffic and then rail. This was done completely on the build, operate, transfer basis, you know, and the government spent almost nothing on it. I think the adjoining roads, including the adjoining roads, are basically being done at this point by a Turkish company that subcontracted to a Korean company, and it's going to basically turn it back to the government in 10, 15 years or something. There's another bridge across the Izmit Bay, which is like a very long bridge, that's done the same way. The tunnel under the Bosphorus done the same way. So the build, operate, transfer model really, I think, brings the private business in a very intelligent way, where the ropes are still in the hands of the municipality, because obviously, contractually, they tie it down so that it can't be abused easily.
Was that controversial initially when there was a proposal to bring private money into it?
There was some controversy because people who don't want the roads and bridges to be made because they will be at the expense of the environment and so on. But there was no controversy because of the mechanism by which it would be financed.
But is it for free by the citizen?
The passage, you know, that's how they make their money back. Build, operate, transfer. So they charge money for a certain amount of years, and the volume of passage on the bridge is expected and projected, so the company who builds it gets their money back, and then they transfer it.
But my question was about do citizens pay, or only government?
No, the citizens pay when they pass. When they pass the bridge, there's a toll.
It won't work in Poland.
No.
But you know, one could argue that the more expensive infrastructure services is the one you don't get. I mean, before the bridge was built, probably the citizens that needed to go from one shore to the other had to pay for boat
had to spend
services.
much more gas going over the
Probably
other
paying
bridge
more.
over a much longer
So
period.
the real alternative is
Yeah, so this is not really, they are not really going to pay any more money than they would have otherwise paid, and their pain level would be substantially
But this is a
lower.
very favorable outcome, the one you're describing, where I understand that the whole initial expenditure was almost entirely reimbursable through user fees. Unfortunately, in many developing countries, you have to blend some kind of public upfront or grant or viability gap financing, some kind of operating subsidy, with private financing that is to be recouped through user fees if you want to keep fees affordable at the end of the day for users. So in many cases, it's some kind of financial engineering combining public and private money.
So, Mayor Waltz.
I would like to comment on this guarantee problem, which is always asked by the World Bank. In the case of the EBRD and EIB, and in fact it was invented by the EBRD, that it is not needed the guarantee of the city. But what is needed a contract, long-term contract between the company, the public transportation company, and the city, that I buy services for example, 15 years, which is obvious because I don't have choice. I buy services because people need buses, subway, and tramways. So because I guarantee that I will buy the service, so the loan is given without any guarantee from both of these institutions.
So you've just sort of set out for us all the different options, funding options you have.
Yes.
You have EIB, EBRD, you have tax.
Bonds, issuing bonds.
Exactly. You have the bond market, you have private companies partnering with the city. How do you look at those different options and which ones, why would you favor one for a particular project and one for another? Is it about the size of the project, about the amount of upfront money, and how you can cope with that over several years?
Yes. First of all, I try to do the project which citizens expect, yes, because this solves certain problems of traffic, etc. So this is one reason. Second reason is very important at the moment, which project will be co-financed by the EU funds. Right. So, for example, is it the project which is supported from the point of view of protection of environment? It's the easiest way to get money from the EU. And this way, we use this way not only for public transport, but as well for the water waste treatment plant, which it was very big investment because it was for about $1 billion. And about 70%, almost 70% we got from the EU. In the case of the subway, we got even 80%. So, I am combining our money with the money which I can get. And at the same time, all of these projects were warmly welcomed by the citizens. Of course, the very, very good product is the city bike. It became very popular. We are not sure in the beginning that it will be so successful, but it's very successful. Of course, the first project of city bike was in Lyon, in France, and then the second in Paris, and in London. Now, in many capital cities, not only capital cities, there are city bikes. So, so I try to combine. Of course, it's not so easy to get money for smaller projects, but if it is possible, we also try to get money from the EU for with smaller amount. For example, we have a special project for the boulevard along Vistula River because it's also environment. Because it's natural and natural side, the right side of the river, and also for example, entrepreneurs. We were in the mediator for about $20 million to small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. So we watch what is available. I should confess, I have very good people who watch. If, for example, railways doesn't use, it means that I can get money for the subways, because it's also the same project, infrastructure and environment.
It's very interesting to hear how you're having to think about what the priorities of these funding sources like the EU are, be it environmental or other things, and you're having to sort of map your own needs to the priorities of the potential sources of...
It's like your investment if you have a rich aunt. So she says, I can buy you this kind of car, but not another car. So because you need a car, so it means I say, okay, aunt, I give you, my cost will be 20 or 30 or 40%, and if you are happy with this kind of car, I will be very happy that you buy me and you give me the money. So we have to respect what aunt wants.
Great analogy. So Dan, from the point of view of a company like IBM, you're not, you can't walk into the mayor's office and offer, and write a check in the way that the EIB might do. What are you offering so financially? We know that you're offering a skill set and one that often cities are quite short of in terms of tech skills. But to what extent do you have to marry that with financial inducements?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, we around the world have done these tolling systems working to create these. Probably the city that is most noted, maybe out of Singapore, but it's really London.
Yep.
And London used the millennium in 2000 to transform what they would do with the roads. And then, of course, it led to the Olympics, and all of that has fundamentally changed the transportation system within London. You can see a progression path, and I believe that the next panel will talk about what you can do with do or die. Do you compete for these kind of events like the Olympics, like the World Cup, like the Pope coming to visit, etc. For the most part, those have become economic undertakings, have been very successful. And I know here in Chicago, they were hopeful to have the Olympics come here, and it was going to redo the west side of the city. And it didn't happen, obviously, but millions of dollars were spent. So it's a big bet. It's a big bet, and we often work very closely with that. The mayor of Atlanta will be here talking about the new stadium that they're creating, which will be a total engagement for people to come and participate. They'll spend a lot of their money there, their disposable income.
Because hot dogs aren't cheap.
Hot dogs are not cheap, that's right, and they'll create other experiences. As a matter of fact, if you came with me right now to Atlanta, not only would you see the stadium being built, but there's a Ferris wheel right next to it, just like there is here at Navy Pier, just like there is at the Eye in London. And so we do work to look at how cities can become vibrant using citizen-based services that they pay for. This idea of being able to build, run, transfer, it goes the other way too. Transfer after you've built and after you've been running that, specifically around buildings, because you have the ability to outsource those buildings and the services for those buildings. This works extremely well in education. It's a reverse view of what we were suggesting here. It has the same positive effect, except you get a check back and you can then use that to be able, but you're outsourcing some of your services that you've been able to do. We see some do that work as well. We've worked with the European Union on things like Digital Hospital, a number of the initiatives that are driven by the EU, where they need a public-private partnership to go into countries like Poland with someone that will deliver on what the EU has asked to be done and where funding will be available. So spend a tremendous amount of time with some of those organizations like the EU in the key funding areas, bringing skill sets, and then approaching someone like you to say, what would you like to do off of the menu of EU opportunities there where we would bring in the skill sets, et cetera. And last but not least, as I mentioned briefly, We have committed into cities where we have teams come in and present ideas. It doesn't cost anything to the cities. There's a competition. It's called the Smarter Cities Challenge. Cities around the world compete. It's roughly $500,000 of consultants that come in, and then they make a recommendation. We're now transitioning that into healthy cities so that we can start working with the health systems to try and do something similar. And just as an example, anyone familiar with Rochester, New York, by chance? So raise your hand. I'll be a great couple of people, Rochester, New York. So Rochester, New York, great town unto itself, and at one time was the home to more millionaires in the U.S. than any other city, because that was where Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, all their cities. Today, unfortunately, Rochester has 80% of their students within Rochester proper go to school in the city at a poverty level. And the governor in the state of New York has set a directive no more than 40%. So Rochester, unfortunately, is double the number of children going to school at a poverty level. So we sent a team in to look at what the possible options would be. And then through public-private partnerships in education, we're now bringing answers to try and take the number of students that are unfortunately showing up to school at a poverty level and get that number down, and so that they can have a good educational experience. So we think of lots of different ways and try and be very creative, whether it's EU, we go first with some funding, or potentially doing some of these public-private partnerships that
you both talk very warmly about sort of citizen-funded services like toll roads, toll bridges. Every time I go back to London, I now live in New York, I get caught out by the congestion charge because I forget about it. But so it's not, it takes some communication, it takes some explaining to the citizen. It's not universally popular when it's first introduced. If you've been driving that road for free forever, there's a hurdle to get over. But how widely do you think that model can be applied? Is there a natural resistance to it?
Politics, of course, as was discussed in the panel last night, gets in the way here. I mean, it's really, otherwise, for every car that's on the road in Istanbul, I think there are 3 parked or something. I may be wrong. So what happens is if you double the number of lanes some night in a miracle, you have the same density of traffic because more people bring their cars out. Exactly. So of the 3 that are parked, more come out because people tolerate up to a certain level. They tolerate up to an hour or something, an hour and 15 minutes. They don't tolerate more. So the more things you build, the more people come out. So there's an easy way out of this, right? There's the metro system actually is now very nice in Istanbul. So if you just said odd numbered plates on Tuesdays and even numbered plates on Wednesdays, bang, you wouldn't solve anything because the other cars will come out. But politically, you can't do that. Politically, this would be damaging. So these
it
types
has been done in some. It has been done in some cities. But
I know it has been, but in a place like Istanbul, this would be unthinkable. So I think a lot of it is education. If you could educate people to use the public transportation more, as it gets reaching to more places. I mean, the metro in Istanbul has been a recent development that has been very successful. You realize Istanbul is a place that has so much history that whatever you dig, you run into some Byzantium art or something. So the construction projects take years as you take that thing out and put it into a museum or something.
Some of this is your branding.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, it's the branding of your city,
right.
in your country. So if we went to Israel, Israel has tolling, but they've embedded the chip technology in a GPS system that's in your car.
Yeah, in the car.
And not only that, they use it for how you pay gas. So what does Israel believe that they export? Intellectual property. Right. And so they're proving that they have great ideas with how they provide citizen-based services for the world to see, because they believe that their natural resource that they export is intellectual property. And they're trying to demonstrate it with ideas such as what you're talking about.
How would the citizens of Warsaw react?
No, in 2012, I tried to increase the price of the tickets, and they organized a referendum to revoke me.
Really?
You're still here, though.
I'm still here.
won.
I survived, yes. Even I won the next elections.
How big was the
But
increase?
people are very touchy, I would
What was
say.
the percentage jump?
Not so big, I don't remember, but no, not so big. And I was explaining for months and months that we construct subway, that we exchanged the buses, and it was visible in the street, the same with the tramways. But it didn't work. It didn't work. So I think that it would be rather, I'm sure not rather, it won't be possible to just to ask for pay for the bridge.
I mean, we talked, there was a lot of discussion
Even
on
with congestion charge, which is in London, it would be difficult.
Yeah.
No, I think you're exactly right, too, by the way, that you cannot just ask for more money. So in Chicago, here, a number of years ago, part of a commission that I had a chance to participate on, we went tolling throughout all of Illinois in Chicago. There was a concern because the people that are inside the toll booths, you know what their skill set was? Changing your dollar to be able to, you see what I'm saying? So part of the funding mechanism for the tolling was then to re-educate those people that were in the toll booths into jobs that they could then be able to deliver back a contribution into society. So today, here in Chicago, if you toll, it's better. If you have to go pay, you're paying close to 4 times as much as you do if you don't toll.
If you go the cash route.
If you go the cash route, you're paying for that. And much of the money that was used initially was to re-educate those individuals that were in the booths that were doing that. So I think there has to be a contribution back into society with this movement towards something like tolling.
So it's very interesting because in Istanbul, the toll booths are all removed now from all bridges. There's no way you can pay. You pass, you have an electronic little chip that counts, and if you don't have that chip, you get a massive ticket because there's a camera that's looking at your license plate. So I don't know where that money goes, but basically, the only way you can pass is to have this chip.
Well, you kind of hope it went into
Directly
citizen-based services.
to the bank probably, and it's at the end of the month you see
There's
that
no person.
you had to pay.
CCTV will get us all in the end.
Maybe on this issue of the acceptability of fees to finance infrastructure assets and the willingness to pay that is to go with it, I believe that the situation indeed can vary widely from one country to the other, or even within the same country. I guess probably not the same culture in the east coast of the U.S. As in the west coast as regards the tolled highways and motorways. But the essential component, as I said, is indeed the capacity to identify the service that you get in exchange for that fee. Let me just take the example of Dakar in Senegal, West Africa. We've conducted there, by we, I mean the World Bank Group, USAID, a few other international actors for development, what is the first toll road in sub-Saharan Africa, leaving aside South Africa.
If you do the Paris-Dakar rally, do you now have to pay a toll?
Well, that might be for the next century, but this is a more modest project, a 30 kilometers project linking the city of Dakar, which sits at the tip of a peninsula, with the suburbs. Everybody told us that it won't fly. It won't be possible, both financially and psychologically. People are not used to pay. There's no way you can do it, and there were no budgetary resources to do it in any other ways than through a PPP, relying at least partly on toll fees. So how did we do it? Basically by showing there would be a very significant gain in terms of travel time for those people that would take the toll road to get from the suburbs to the downtown city, cutting basically from 1 hour to 15 minutes. Those that don't have the capacity to pay, that would still take the sort of small networks of lanes and streets, also benefit from it because the big chunk of the traffic has been diverted to the toll roads. So the pre-existing roads are now much more easy to drive, and you also get a benefit even if you don't pay for it. Population on the side of the toll road has been resettled with all this sort of due diligence, economic and social sort of conditions to make sure that they were basically resettled in good conditions. And overall, the situation has now effectively enabled the city to go for the state-of-the-art toll road at the same level that you would find in Europe or the US. There is, however, a sort of a bind to it, which is that it could not be done entirely out of private financing. It had to rely to a significant extent on public sort of upfront grants. Otherwise, again, the situation wouldn't have been possible or affordable for the local populations. But it tends to show that it can be done if you have a clear view of what you get in exchange. And just as a quick reminder, I mean, in history, at least before the First World War, most of our transportation networks or infrastructure in Europe were built using this model. I mean, the fact that government should pay for infrastructure network is a relatively new development in the history of our...
If you go back to the early editions, the Financial Times from 1888, it was all that, basically. It was,
well, just
Trans-Siberian Railroads, I think.
Another interesting example, would you pay for a shorter line at the airport? It happens to be called TSA. You either pay $100 or $85 to qualify for TSA, and you get a shorter line. It's the same space. It's the same people. You're going to the same place. But for a citizen-based service of less time, you're willing to pay $85 or $100, depending on whether or not you have global entry for a global entry or $85 for a local entry. Okay. So this idea that you're talking about, it is very real, and all of us have it. You may even exercise it this afternoon when you go back to the airport.
So, I mean, we're getting onto the question of affordability here. You know, and it's one thing for a bunch of regular business travelers to pay $185 to get through a shorter line at the TSA, but if we're talking about the people of Dakar, if we're talking about the average voter in Warsaw,
yes.
You know, not everybody is going to have that kind of, you know, feel easy about throwing that kind of money around.
In fact, it
how
doesn't
do you
exist.
factor those questions of affordability into your decisions about financing the projects?
I can give you an example which is positive. So when we made this investment in water treatment, so we had to increase altogether year after year, I think about the cost of water for about 25%. And people accepted it, but I tried to explain that it will be not polluted water, that it will be good sewage system, and maybe it was the sum were not extremely big because it's water. The tickets is more expensive, yes, but it was accepted. But I promised that later on, for certain period, the prices will be kept on the same level when we finish the investment. So with water, it was a positive example.
Water is a wonderful example globally. 30% of all water is spilled and not used. It's one of the great challenges that we have in society today. And I think water is an excellent place for cities and regions to start, because they're overpaying for water right now for sure, just because
it's pretty fundamental.
But it was difficult discussion about the garbage, you know, because we introduced the new European system with the how to say, sorting the garbage, and in the beginning it was a difficult conversation.
at the end of the day, there are not many ways to fund infrastructure services. It's either taxes or user fees, or a combination of both in between. So one way to do it is to try and assess whether the service you're considering has a more sort of a social dimension, in which case you might want to fund most of it out of taxes receipts, or whether it's more of a commercial dimension, say, for example, telecommunications network, things like this, in which case the bulk of the funding would come through user fees and not from the taxpayers. But, I mean, except in very specific situation like the one you were in just after adhering to the European Union, where you get grants, but this is unfortunately not a very widespread situation in many developing countries. There's no way you can get around this. It has to be a combination of both.
But I would suggest the World Bank to do the same what was done by the EIB without guarantee.
Well, we try to do it for the poorest country, the lowest income country, but we can't do it for every country.
I want to come back to that, François, but Umran.
I agree that I think it should be case by case, because we have in Istanbul and in Ankara, in Turkey, we have the issue of urban transformation, it's called. And it happens in two ways. One, in Istanbul, in the last 30 years, construction has been absolutely rampant with no city planning. So it's just a complete confusion out there, and it's an earthquake zone. So now, urban transformation is motivated to convert buildings that are not earthquake safe to buildings that are earthquake safe. So in this case, think of a 4-story building, each flat owned by an individual person. And this now, they take away your license because they deem it unsafe. So now a private contractor comes in, and instead of the 4-story, builds a 6-story, a little smaller building, gets the top 2 flats and gives them the other flats. So this is privately funded. But if you have a shanty town that you want to just get rid of because of variety of reasons of the city development, this has to be, I agree with my fellow completely, has to be funded by the government, because there's no other way that this can be taken from there and put into some tall building by giving each of them flats. So this has to be case by case. But urban transformation in cities like Istanbul is a major, major challenge.
So I think that it requires, certainly leadership matters here,
Yes.
but you have to connect the dots in a different way. Let me give you another example. In Mexico, not Mexico City, but the second largest city outside of Mexico City, they have Mexico Tech. They have 80, 90,000 students there. There's funding available on communications that the country is going to do on grants to expand the network. The idea to create radiologists that can read images throughout the entire region of Mexico and into Latin America and South America, and be able to use the students and train the students for those types of jobs, to be able to do that within Mexico, is a tremendous opportunity to take grant and funding money that Mexico is giving for communications, use it for a telecommunication strategy for how you would then do radiology, train radiologists at the Mexico Tech, and then be able to create a center of excellence for radiology region within the radiology reading for that region. A tremendous example of how they could potentially connect the dots and create value.
François, can
If
go
I
ahead.
may say, because you mentioned that we get these funds, yes, but at the same time, we organize European tender, and for example, in the case of the privatization of our heating company, it was bought by Veolia from France, so they did business. Second thing, our subway, again, it was a European tender. It is a consortium of Italian and Turkish company. Turkey is not yet in the EU, but Italy invested in more. Now they construct roads. Italians, Spanish they construct. So in fact, it's not only that we get the money, but the other countries, more developed countries of the EU, they make business in Poland.
I was very struck by the sort of by sort of subtle difference between what you're saying here and what I was hearing on the opening panel, where the opening panel was basically saying there's plenty of money out there waiting to invest in infrastructure, but politics gets in the way. It slows everything down, it confuses everything, it delays everything. What you seem to be saying is the politics are not driven just by a bunch of slow bureaucrats, it's driven by the voter, by the citizen who's resisting a lot of this, who's not willing, who hasn't seen the case for participating in the investment needed.
That's true, it depends a lot of the citizens, but you should be balanced, I hope. Maybe there is no aim for the 10th year, because you have to explain that certain measures have to be undertaken. On the other hand, you can't exaggerate too much. So not so many promises. I do this for free, I never said. My competitor used to say that the public transport will be free when he wins. So I never promised these kind of things. But of course, you have to watch the resilience and the affordability, which is not so easy.
Now, I want to give we've got about 15 minutes, I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions of the panel. We've got microphones, I believe. Does anybody have a question we've got one over here, if we could just get a microphone in the middle, please. And if you could just tell us your name and keep the question fairly short and directed to one of our panelists.
Joyce Coffey with Climate Resilience. My question is if you can share how you believe the bond or credit rating market and the insurance market impact financing in cities, and if you might also relate how you think future predicted risks around climate change are impacted by both of those two levers, the credit rating and insurance markets.
Do you want to take that, François?
Yeah, so obviously bond issuance, bond financing is a sort of an ultimate goal for financing big infrastructure projects, just like the way it works here in the US, where the majority of municipal investments are financed through tax-exempt bond financing. But it takes a long road to get there. And again, there's a sort of long process of, starting from the very basics. In many cities in developing countries, they don't even know how many bank accounts they have, where the money flows goes in or goes out. So you have to start by sort of building a sort of financial management system, consolidating bank accounts, optimizing the management of expenditure and revenues, improving tax collection, user fees collection, building a credit history, doing what we call public expenditure and financial accountability reviews, training the public officials, and then once you've improved your overall creditworthiness, improve the share of your own source revenue, once you've put in place the enabling environment, which doesn't depend only on the municipal government level, it might also be an issue with the national government, whether or not foreign currency borrowing is allowed for subnational governments, the sort of overall fiscal or monetary environment at the national policy level, this type of regulations that also need to be factored in. So once you've worked on this, basically you've created the conditions, what we call an enabling environment for private market-based financing of infrastructure. Typically, we would first go for some kind of bank loans borrowing. It's easier to manage, but you don't get the same sort of tenors, maturity, long tenors, particularly from local banks. So ideally, the eventual goal that we would set ourselves when we assist cities in developing countries is effectively to enable them to get to that stage where they can raise on the merits of their balance sheet, of their financial management, without the need for a sovereign guarantee by the central state, when they can raise municipal bond financing. But I can tell you, it takes a long time and a lot of efforts before we can get there.
You asked, in your question, it was very thoughtful, and you asked two pieces. One is the financial aspect. The second, you asked about weather, and you started to ask about predictive measures. And so not only is it weather, but it's also crime, and it's also about, are you going to be able to take advantage? If I'm going to give you the money, are you going to get the return out of it that I would expect? And you have to address these other aspects, such as weather, crime, security, et cetera. Is that right? So your question was really thoughtful. It had two sides to it. One is, how do you finance it? And second, you talked about conditions. Recently, IBM bought the weather company. Here in the US, there's 8 million users of that information today. The idea to be able to have that as be a predictive measure, along with cybersecurity and some of the crime area, exactly some of the solution areas that we're trying to, now it's the chicken and the egg. You have to have that before you go ask for the money and I go to my banker, or do I have to have it after? So I think you're asking a very good question.
If I may, just very briefly on this, indeed, infrastructure is by nature very long-term. Over the long term, sort of extreme climate events, extreme weather is not just a risk and sort of a probability, an act of God, it's almost certain. So it has to be sort of factored in the design and the implementation and the way you will manage these new infrastructure assets and services. And in this sense, I mean, developing countries, cities have an advantage because they start from scratch. I mean, they don't have to adapt or mitigate these impacts out of existing infrastructure assets. They can effectively design and incorporate that from the beginning. And the private sector would be, I believe, a very good candidate to effectively manage this risk. PPPs, basically, it's all about allocating risk between the private and the public.
Can do long-term, can think long-term in that way?
If the sort of terms of reference and the contractual framework is inciting it to do it, right. Yes, I think that they would be in the position, and that's what we're trying to do again, actually, through technical assistance, make sure that the sort of PPP contractual schemes we have available right now can effectively sort of analyze, allocate, and optimize this level of long-term risk linked to weather changes, what we call climate smart PPPs in terms of mitigation or adaptation to climate change, and make it possible and make it financeable through these schemes.
Great. Can we have another question? Just here on the aisle, if we get and again, just tell us who you are and where you're from.
Thank you very much. My question involved your example of the TSA. The bureaucracy and the TSA has been functioning for X number of years, but you could only sign up for the TSA at certain airports.
Correct.
It's only, it was the lack of insight on the bureaucracy that held TSA back, and that they say really has caused the terrible lines at the airport.
Yes.
At $75 or $80 for 5 years. If they had put those in the neighborhood five years ago or 7 years ago, it would have been a very easy sell, and I don't think we would have this thing today.
No question. And I think that's where leadership matters, to have the insight to be able to predict what that's going to look like over a period of time. Couldn't agree with you more, and now we're in a situation where they want to fire the guy that runs it. So, excellent point.
Can we, second row here, please. Thanks.
Dan Barrow with the Chicago, Warsaw Sister Cities. Some points were brought up about climate change, about chips in cars, urban planning. And I think this is a question more for Madam Mayor and from Dan from IBM. How is or how can big data be used to help decision-making in urban planning? And is there something on the horizon that's going to help leaders of these large urban centers to plan better?
Do you want to take that first, Mayor Waltz? How are you using big data in Warsaw?
Big data, we use big data all the time because it's like the test which you have to do before going to the doctor. Yes, so in fact, we do our business plan and we based on the domestic or international data. That's it. If we do it very well. It's difficult for me to assess this.
Where do you think it's made the most difference to the city? Where have you seen the biggest returns on investment in data?
I think that it's we have in the case of this investment, which I mentioned first of all, we use it. Second, we collect, yes, from different sources. Second, it's checked by the EU. It's checked by JASPERS. So we have different kind of institutions, especially for the investment with the EU. We check if the data which we are collecting, they were right. Now, by the way, talking about the data, we just rent to the university, to the Faculty of Mathematics, the land, they are creating a big data center because the School of Mathematics is very high in Poland. We are obliged to pass an exam on mathematics when we are graduated from school. So in fact, we have very good programmers and mathematics, and we decided not to sell this land, but offer to the faculty, and they will organize a very big data center, but for everybody, not only for us.
Right. Dan, I feel this is a setup for you.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll be somewhat brief and maybe direct. Trash, refuge, security, transportation are the key areas where we're seeing most people put together dashboards that will pick up trash. I mean, you just go through Chicago right now. I think Chicago looks like a far different city than it did many years ago. It's beautiful. And they know when they're picking up trash and when things need to be done. And also to activate citizens, where citizens can, on their phone, be able to indicate that something didn't get picked up that should have been picked up. Crime zones, able to identify those, put more lights there. I think the mayor talked about that when he talked to you, Mayor Emanuel, just maybe yesterday, some of the work that he's doing. And then the idea on transportation, we talked about that a little bit. You see lanes closed, you see lanes open, you see construction projects to redirect things. This is where big data is starting to get far more predictive, and consequently, then you can open up areas like the West Loop for new housing that would be less expensive than it had been before, because you can move those kind of services into those areas. So that's all big data. It's going into dashboards. It's happening around the world. And the good news is you have recurring assets. The same information is reusable, and it's allowing you to cut 10, 20, 30% of the services that you had, because you're doing it off of a cloud platform that's recurring assets, and be able to do it in a far different way. So.
Let's try and squeeze in another question.
You need to have also, if I can add, you need also to know how to use it, because before the crisis, everybody had plenty of data, bigger, smaller, and the crisis happened, because you need to not only to collect, but to make to analyze, This is a very important thing.
All right. You've had your hand up for a long time. Let's just take a question from the front.
Yep. Alan Harder with Risk Strategies and the Bogota Sister Cities Committee. What implications do disruptive technologies like telematics, self-driving cars, the sharing economy, and the smart grid have on global cities? And do you have any examples of global cities that have used these innovations?
Nice narrow question there for the last 3 minutes that we have. Any examples come to mind there?
I can see the future of delivery with drones and all that that will happen with in cities, but I don't have an example of where this is happening right now. But I think, as Dan said, transportation, delivery, and all these are now going to be basically, when I'm leaving my home with my iPhone, I'm going to look at land, sea, rail, whichever one is available on my route. I will be able to see each bus in the city, where it is, what time it's going to be where, and so on, and I'm going to be basically responding accordingly.
Yeah, I'll take it in a little different direction for you. As we go to smart grids, We have got to address the cybersecurity issues that are in front of us, because as we put more power in those smart grids to drive our cities around the world, if you wanted to take out the eastern seaboard, Washington and New York, you'd go right between, you hit the power grids, the smart grids that are right there. We have got to, around the world, pay attention to some of these challenges on security and cybersecurity and protect these areas. It gives us tremendous benefit, but they're big targets too. And so as we go forward with this, there is a responsibility by leaders to be able to protect their citizens and ensure that they're safe. And so when you start talking about smart grids, there's that other side of it, I think, that has to be addressed as well, that security side. That's very important.
I just wanted to end on one quote and one wrap up, and just to come back to our point about affordability. Another quote that struck me in the FT special report on global cities this week was from Edward Glaser, a Harvard economist, who said, if you increase inequality by plopping in a bunch of tech billionaires in an area, that can't be bad for growth. What we should be worrying about, though, is whether cities are places of opportunity for the poor. I just wondered if I could just squeeze in a question for you. Do you feel, from a World Bank perspective, what you're doing in financing is managing to create cities that are places of opportunity for the poor?
Well, that would certainly be the objective, giving
but the results we've seen in recent years have been widening inequality.
A sort of inclusive urban growth infrastructure strategy. Now, having said that, it's a challenge, obviously. We need to keep in mind that the capacity to play on all the sort of tools we have in terms of financing, blending, combining, stretching over time. Affordability, we mentioned the bond sort of financing technique. Bond can directly generate greater affordability, not only because they can be cheaper in terms of rate than bank or other forms of borrowing, but also because they stand for a longer duration. So if you have to pay a debt service that is spread over a longer period of time, you make the service more affordable. So all this is sort of contributes to eventually, effectively offer conditions that should make it possible for the poorest to get the promise of the city delivered.
Okay. With that, I'm going to conclude. My takeaways from that are that we may be plunged into outer darkness by the hacking of the smart grid, but as long as the commute and the wait at the TSA line is short, we'll be fine. With that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and we will now have a short break. We will reconvene here at 3:30 p.m. sharp.